Welcome back to NPTEL, the National Program on Technology Enhanced Learning. As you are aware, these lectures are being brought to you by the Indian Institutes of Technology and the Indian Institute of Science. We are in module 4 of these series of lectures, and you are aware that the fourth module is devoted entirely to literary criticism. We have several schools of criticism here which we are going to talk about, to discuss, and we have already been through 2 of these, and today the topic is Marxist literary criticism. In the last 2 lectures we saw, we looked at some of the important postulations, given by classical literary criticism and by liberal humanism. And we are now today moving into a very important, if not the most important, school of literary criticism, which has had a rich tradition and a long history. Before we go to Marxist literary criticism proper, it is very important for us to know what Marxism as an approach, as an ideology, as a critical tool, as an analytical tool entails, right. Some of you, we are sure, are aware of the main postulates, the main theoretical, you would say, or you could say that the main propositions of Marxism as a whole. But let us at the beginning of today's lecture first look at what the main points in Marxism are, right. You are aware that the 2 most important figures in Marxism are Karl Marx and his collaborator Friedrich Engels. And you are also aware that perhaps the most famous treatise by them, written by them, is entitled The Communist Manifesto. Now, what exactly is Marxism, right? Or as an approach, and as said, as a tool, as an analytical tool studying society, politics, philosophy, literature, right? What are the most important things that we as students of language or literature ought to know, right? So, let us come to the first slide here. Generally, their approach is known as historical materialism. Now, we need to look at first at these 2 terms, historical and materialism, or history and matter. Before we ask the important questions within historical materialism, we need to know what materialism is. Materialism does not mean materialistic, or somebody who somebody for whom material things, or say luxury goods or consumer goods are very dear, or are somebody who lives a life that is known as a materialistic, quote unquote materialistic life. Here it is different. Materialism is usually understood versus another term in philosophy, namely idealism. Now, I cannot go into detail about these, but suffice it for us here to know that idealism is an approach, is a school of thought, is an ideology, so to speak, that looks, or that considers the idea or the spirit, as the most, as the source, source of whether it is life, or the source of meaning, or the source of our destinies. One of the most important proponents of idealism was the German philosopher G.W.F. Hegel. right. Hegel believed in what he called the absolute spirit. Okay. He believed in a Platonic sort of way. Okay, where we know that Plato believed in forms that are eternal, and this world being only a mere reflection of those eternal forms, right. Likewise, Hegel believed in the idea that everything emanated from an eternal idea with a capital I, okay, idea, and that we are a mere reflection of that eternal idea or God or absolute spirit, right. On the other hand, materialism completely rejects the idea or forms or God or absolute spirit as the source of all life, all meaning and all movement in history. Okay. Materialism holds that matter is supreme, okay, that all meaning, all life, all social arrangements are destinies, so to speak. Now, here by destiny I do not mean the way we understand destiny in preordained sort of a religious sort of ways. That destiny is simply how our lives are going to work themselves out. Okay. The source of all this is matter. More about that a while. So, suffice it for us to understand here at this stage simply with these two terms, historical materialism, that the source of all meaning, the source of our life, the source of all our arrangements, social, economic, political, is matter, and it has a historical, it has a history behind it, right. The kind of lives that we are leading here today is a result of history, looked at from a material sense. Okay. So, we understand what materialism is, that it is not being materialistic in the sense of liking have fancy cars, etc. right. So, let us look at this slide here. What would historical materialism seek to study? Historical materialism seeks to study things like the organization and structure of societies. Okay. So, it would ask questions like how are societies organized and structured, and second, how do these societies develop and change. Okay. So, in the first case is really the structure and the organization of society, and the second is society in motion. Okay. What leads to social change? Why do societies change? Okay. We know that societies do not remain the same, social arrangements, rules, regulation, norms, etc. Okay. The kind of lives that we lead are these are never the same, these change. So, Marxism through its historical materialist approach seeks to give us answers, right. So, here we see in this slide that the structure of societies and the causes of change of societies, the movement of societies, okay, the nature of their movement, these are basically speaking, these are the things that are sought to be understood by Marxism as a whole. As you know, we have not yet moved into Marxist literary criticism. Next, again, the two very important terms in Marxism. Okay. So, we know that we study socio-cultural change, structure, organization and change. Okay. And we ask the question why do societies change and what are the causes of social change, right. So, Marx held that among other things the forces of production, okay, those productive forces which contribute towards the production of our material lives, right, and the relations of production, that is the relations between or among people in the production process, right, among people are are determined by or are related to, so to speak, to the forces of production. Okay. These together we understand as what they called what Marx called the mode of production. That is, every historical epoch is going to be characterized by a certain mode, okay, a certain mode of production, okay, certain mode of production, or you could say a certain way of production. Right. Now, let me give you a few examples. What are these modes of production? Modes of production are, as we know, these are this really is it's interesting that Marxism is both a micro and a macro theory. Okay, so if you look at history is explained in Marxism as marked by different ways of production. Production of what? Production of essentially our material lives, right? Now, examples here would be, for instance, ancient slavery. In ancient slavery, you had a certain way of production. In feudalism, you had a certain way of production where land was the most important factor, and the relations of production essentially were, maybe characterized by two sort of binary, opposite social strata, like for instance, the landlord and on the other hand the tenant who works on the land and on the landlord's farm. Okay. Now, these are relations of production which are sort of corresponding to the mode of production that is there in the time. So, social change is explained as a crisis, so to speak, happening in history, okay, during certain times when the forces of production are the forces of production are not sort of in sync with the relations of production. Okay, when the forces of production they develop at such a, what are forces of production? Forces of production are different factors that go into the production process. Technology could be one, science and technology, for instance. Okay, and these are the social organization is such that the social relations of production act as Marx says, act as chains or fetters on the forces of production. The forces of production eventually sort of are free or free themselves from the social relations of production, and society moves into, if you want to understand understand the source of why society changes, okay, it's because the forces of production and relations of production are sort of at odds, right, and the forces of production sort of are free from the social relations of production, and society moves on to another epoch. Okay. Then the next important terms are the base and the superstructure. Marx argued that in every society and every mode of production, every epoch, there is what we can have a two-tier, almost an architectural sort of metaphor is used here, a two-tier structure of and sort of an infrastructural base, okay, and the superstructure. The base, if you look at the slide here, the base comprises again the forces of production and the relations of production. Okay, the base is an economic base, to put it very simply here. Of course, the base is an economic base. Now, Marx says that according to, right, this is very important, according to the nature of the economic base, there would arise corresponding superstructural elements. Now, in the superstructure, he said that these are essentially, to put it, to use one term only for it, is these are cultural elements. For instance, corresponding to, now remember we are using words like corresponding to, okay, Marx never meant that these are deterministic, that the base is completely going to determine. Okay, he kept it more, he gave it more space really, and he understood the enormous complexity of the superstructural elements. Okay, so he says that these are determined by, or these correspond to, right, the economic base. And here we find the legal system, for instance, then a very important social institution like the family, religion, education, and eventually our consciousness. Now, when we study Marx's literary criticism, what are we going to do? Where are we going to place the literary text? It is obvious to us that the literary text would be in the superstructure. Am I correct here? Okay. The products, art for instance, the products of our consciousness, right, like art, will also be related to the economic base, that is the forces of production and the relations of production, or what we may call the mode of production. This is very important for us to understand before we go to study what Marxist literary criticism is. Okay? Again, to quickly recapitulate, Marxism studies, or Marxism, the aim of Marxism is to study the organization and structure of society. Okay? Second, to study how societies and why societies change, how they develop from one epoch to another. Okay? We call it historical materialism because we understand the past in terms of, or in relation to, in very important relation to history, or to the, the present to history. That is, the present is always determined by history, and we do away with the idealist Hegelian way of looking at the idea is the most important source of everything, and here the idea is replaced by matter. So, our material economic arrangements, right, give rise, which is the base, give rise to the superstructural elements in our culture, among which we find art also, or being a very important part. Okay? So, Marx laid great importance on social consciousness, right. For instance, as we will find later on, he said that our consciousness does not determine, our consciousness and does not determine the kind of societies we have, but it is the kind of societies we have that eventually, or that will always determine the kind of consciousness that we have. Here, when we say consciousness, we do not mean simply aware, as being conscious or as being aware of things, right. We mean by consciousness here, we mean really our everything, our mental consciousness, our emotional consciousness, our intellectual consciousness, our moral consciousness, right. So, all our norms, our so called virtues, our so called evil aspects, or everything that is part of our consciousness, our ideas of good and bad, our ideas of, for instance, the best social and the best economic or the best political arrangement, okay, our ideas of the best literary text, for instance. Okay, these are all to be understood in the term consciousness here. It is not just being like I am conscious or I am aware of my surroundings in a sort of cognitive sort of way. Okay? So, let us read from this slide, which will make this first point clear to us. Okay? When we talk about historical materialism, we have to remember these words from Marxism, okay, that men make their own history, but they do not make it just as they please. They do not make it under circumstances chosen by themselves, but under circumstances directly found, given and transmitted from the past. The tradition of all the dead generations weighs like a nightmare on the brain of the living. Now, we obviously these words are beautifully put. This says that there is no doubt we make our own history or we make our own destinies, okay? But the past plays a most important part in sort of the carving out of our destinies or of our histories. Now, we are going to move into Marxist literary criticism proper, and what I have done in this lecture is, obviously there are several ways in which you can or we could talk about a Marxist literary criticism. Okay, sometimes we can just refer to one book, for instance Terry Eagleton's very important book on Marxist literary criticism. What I have done here, however, is I have tried to bring to you some of the important formulations, comments and pronouncements on Marxist literary criticism from a couple of sources. Okay, so in a bit to enrich our understanding of Marxism, and in that with that view in mind, we have first a quotation from Plekhanov, right, who says that the social mentality of an age is conditioned by that age's social relations. This is nowhere quite as evident as in the history of art and literature. Okay? We talked about social relations of production just a while ago when we referred to the two very important terms, the forces of production and the social relations of production in Marxism. Okay. Now, this is how we move into literary criticism for Marxism, and one of the better ways is to put it through Plekhanov, for instance. What does he say? He says here that the social mentality of any age, okay, is conditioned or is determined by the social relations of that age. Right. This is a point also when we saw when we talked about the the base and the superstructure, okay, the base. Now, here Plekhanov lays more importance on the social relations of production. He says that the social relations of production, now again, what is a social relation of production? Okay, simply put, for instance, in a capitalist system, okay, the worker, right, the worker and the owner of the means of production, okay, the capitalist, that is a relation, social relation of production. Okay. The relation between or among workers, that also is a relation of production, which is determined by the way the production process is arranged. It is very important. Okay. And the economic mode of production that is on, and the forces, the nature of the forces of production, even the degree of development of the forces of production. Okay. Now, the social relations condition the kind of mentality. Now, this mentality is also related to the word consciousness that we found a while ago. Okay. So, Plekhanov says that how are we to gauge, how are we to understand the nature, okay, even the complexities of the social mentality of any age. He says you only need to look at the art, particularly the literature, okay, of a certain period. The literature of a certain period is more or less going to tell you what the social mentality of that particular epoch was like. Right. Now, obviously, it is not so simple as that all the literary text of a certain age is going to be reflective of its social relations. It is of course far more complex, and it should be so. But if we have to theorize on the nature of the literary text in relation to the mentality, social collective mentality of a particular period, then we can safely say that the literature of a period, okay, shows us the social mentality in all, again qualifying it, okay, in all its complexities, in all its different hues, right, in all its problematics, okay, of that arises from the social relations of that particular epoch. And go back, where does the social relation come from? Where do the social relations of a particular age come from? They eventually come from the mode of production or the economic arrangement. Do you understand? Now, from this slide really, what we have done is we have begun to relate the literary text to Marxist propositions or to Marxist statements. Do you follow? I hope this is an important point here, an important juncture in our lecture today, right? So, we talked about historical materialism, base and superstructure, forces of production, relations of production, and we've come to the literary text as being, as being a complex indicator, so to speak, of the social mentality that arises from the social relations and the economic relations of an age. Okay. So, this really is one of the part of the theorizing of the literary text in relation to Marxism. Now, we will go straight to a quotation from Karl Marx himself, okay, from the Grundrisse. Now, many say that Marx and also Engels didn't really, talk so much about the literary text, about literature. Okay. Whatever you find are more or less sort of sporadic. There are collections on Marx and Engels on literature and art, for instance. Okay. But it is said that their main focus was not obviously the literary text, but there are some brilliant insights that we get, particularly from Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, Okay. When you look at some, whenever or wherever they do talk about literature, art, and its relation, their relation to to social relations and forces of production, the modes of production, we find some brilliant insights that are given, which are then taken up by other scholars who practice criticism or theory from a Marxist perspective. One such quotation, and this is something that is oft quoted, is from the Grundrisse. Now, let us read from here. Marx asks this question: is Achilles possible when powder and shot have been invented? And is the Iliad possible at all when the printing press and even printing machines exist? Okay. So, here first we find that Marx is, through asking these questions, is actually making a statement, okay, that in a time when there was the printing machine and the printing press, epics like the Iliad, okay, by Homer would not have been possible. In a way, what is he saying? He's tying the literary text, an epic, to the material realities of its time, okay, by contrasting it, the material realities of the time of Homer to the material realities of England, for instance, during the time of the printing press, of the time of Caxton. He is proposing this, that an epic like the Iliad would not have been written in a time of the printing press. The time of the printing press is also the time of the beginning of the rise of the middle class, okay, which is again important for the rise of the novel. So, the epic now takes a new form, which is the novel, in a time which is in a time which is very different, okay, not just as not from the point of view of the ideas that were extant during that time, but also from the point of view of the material conditions. Okay. Let us read this again. Is Achilles possible when powder and gunshot have been invented, and is the Iliad possible at all when the printing press and even printing machines exist? Is it, now he asks, is it not inevitable that with the emergence of the press bar, the singing and the telling and the muse cease? That is, the conditions necessary, look at this, the conditions necessary for epic poetry disappear. In this question, really he is giving us a statement that the way of the epic, the nature of the epic, okay, is bound to disappear, okay, with the changes that are, or with the disappearance of a certain material way of life. Do you understand? Okay, he says singing, the telling and the muse, these cease to exist. Okay, these factors of the epic, these cease to exist, with the emergence of the press. Okay. So, now again this is yet another example of how materialism is then in this sense understood as the source, okay, of what even the genre, right, how changes in material lives can also change, or in material conditions can also change the very genre of, okay, of literary texts. Then it is often argued that with Marxism, okay, a way of writing which is the realist mode is deeply entwined, right. Now, Marx's and Engels's demands on the artist, now most of what I am reading here is from Terry Eagleton, okay. Marx's and Engels's demands on the artist include truthfulness of depiction, right, almost a verisimilitude, okay, truthfulness of depiction, a concrete historical approach to the events described and personages with live and individual traits reflecting typical aspects of the character and psychology of the class milieu to which they belong. Okay, so there is a certain, not a mere reflectionism, not a simplistic reflectionism, but from a Marxist point of view, we would expect, right, we would expect that the characters that are depicted in a novel, for instance, right, which is again, which is again constrained by time and space, where we know, okay, from which social milieu these characters come from, the time during which the time of the setting of the novel, for instance. Okay, Marx and Engels required, or Marxism requires, that the artist be faithful in his or her depiction of the characters. It says the characters where even the individual, right, the individual traits of individual characters have to correspond to a certain type that was, that was characteristic of a certain time. Okay. Now, let us quickly read this again. Marx and Engels' demands on the artist include truthfulness of depiction, a concrete historical approach to the events described, and personages with live and individual traits reflecting typical aspects of the character and psychology of the class milieu to which they belong. The author of genuinely realistic works communicates his ideas to the reader not by didactic philosophizing, right, but by vivid images which affect the reader's consciousness and feelings by their artistic expressiveness. This word is very important here, didactic. There are many, many scholars who are, how shall we put it, who are anti-Marxist, or who do not, who argue against Marxist literary criticism, importantly by saying that Marxist literary criticism is didactic, right. So, in the sense that it is, as they say, too ideological, right, that it is almost again propagandist. But as Eagleton says, Marxist literary criticism expects, right, that the artist, when he or she is is sketching his characters, delineating events, for instance, be true to the actualities of those times, okay, and instead of philosophizing in a didactic or even in a doctrinaire fashion, right, would with vivid realist or realistic images, right, express their ideas, or have the literary piece come out as an artistic expression, okay, which is far above the the didactic or moralizing philosophy that one would expect. This is very important. What this also suggests, that Marxist literary criticism was not looking for propagandist kind of literature. It only asks that there be a connection, okay, there be not simply a connection, but there be a faithful depiction of the time and the types of characters that were or are there in a particular stretch of time or space. Now, let me quote from Yau's, okay, his essay Literary History as a Challenge to Literary Theory, because here he makes an important distinction. He talks about Marxism by making an important distinction between another school of thought that many of us are here are aware of, that is formalism, particularly of the Russian school. Now, he says that the formalist school needs the reader only as a perceiving subject, right, who follows the directions in the text in order to perceive its form or discover its techniques or of procedure. As you know, form was enormously important in Russian formalism. That is why the word formalism, right, form. And he says that it is only enough for the reader to kind of discover, the techniques or the formal aspects, take joy and pleasure in sort of unraveling the, identifying the formalist nature of, formalist elements in a text. Okay. It assumes that the reader has the theoretical knowledge of a philologist sufficiently versed in the tools of literature to be able to reflect on them. So, one expects that the reader should be, in formalism, should be well acquainted with, the various tools tools of analyzing literary texts, and should be able to discover, so to speak, the beauty of the formal elements. On the other hand, he says the Marxist school, on the other hand, actually equates the spontaneous experience. This is important. Okay, where here the reader is assumed to be, as I said, sufficiently well versed or well trained, okay, in understanding the literary text. But on the other hand, he says, on the Marxist school actually equates to, look at this word here, the spontaneous experience of the reader with the scholarly interest of historical materialism. Now, by spontaneous, we are not stopping at simply spontaneously experiencing a literary text. Okay. Along with one spontaneous response to a literary text, one also expects the reader to bring in his or her scholarly interest of historical materialism, which again let us read, which seeks to discover relationships between, now this is most important, discover, here you discover the form, okay, or the technique, and take sort of take pleasure out of discovering the the nuances of technique and procedure. On the other hand, in the Marxist approach, what we do is we discover not the formal elements, but let us look at this here, seeks to discover the relationships, okay, relationship between the economic basis of production and the literary work as part of the intellectual superstructure. This I need you to really look at very carefully, because it's really, I brought in Yasus's words here, it's because it really, I think he strikes the right chord, okay, by saying that it's not that Marxist literary criticism engages itself only with kind of an archival work, or almost you could say even an architectural sort of work, where you are trying to dig out history and trying to make correlations between the text and the text position in space and time. It says no, there is great joy, this great spontaneity of the reader, and when the reader is equipped, right, with understanding the historical realities of the text, then the pleasure, the so called readerly pleasure of or the pleasure of reading a text comes when you discover, as he says, the relationship here between the economic basis of a particular age of and in its production process, and the literary work as, remember, the part of what? Part of the consciousness, the cultural consciousness of a time, or what he calls here the intellectual part of the intellectual production of the superstructure. Okay. This is very important for us to understand. Again, who are the three scholars we saw here? A. Plekhanov, of course, Marx himself, when he asks the question, right, would the Iliad have been possible, okay, or why, on the other hand, why is an epic not the most important genre during say the 18th century England, right? It is because the material conditions have changed. Okay. Second, we looked at Georgy Plekhanov, who said that the social mentality of an age is related to its social relations, okay, and we also know that the social relations are related to the forces of production, the economic arrangements, and he claimed that nowhere is this relation most well sort of demonstrated than in the art and literature of a time. Okay. Then we found through Terry Eagleton, when he talks about the literary text here, when he talks about realism, okay, and he talks about the importance or even the expectation in Marxist literary criticism that there should be a faithful depiction of characters, of setting, right, according to the historical time in which the text is set. Then we came to Yaus, who compares Marxist literary criticism and the formalist school, and says that whereas in the formalist school we try to unravel, we try to get pleasure, in the reading process by unraveling the formal structures of a text, okay, by unraveling, the procedures that have been used, okay. In contrast to that, in Marxist literary criticism, we have, the spontaneous reading of a text tied to an understanding of the historical realities of that text, and understanding a text, a writer, as part of the superstructural elements of any age. Okay, as it says here, to discover the relationship between the economic base of production and the literary work as part of the intellectual superstructure. Okay, these are immensely important formulations. I would really say these are the core formulations that those of you who are beginning Marxist literary criticism, we know this lecture is really a basic level lecture in a basic level course, okay, that has been designed for students particularly in engineering colleges who have their first exposure to language and literature. Okay. It is important for us to understand this systematically, right, to find out what Marxism says about society, okay, about social change and organization, and b, where the literary text lies as far as the entire Marxist framework is concerned, what according to them is the function of the literary text, and secondly, how is a reader to approach a literary text, how is a reader to understand or perceive a literary text, and we saw this in contrast to the formalist school. Okay, then coming back to Terry Eagleton and again quoting from Marxism and literary criticism, Eagleton says art and literature were part of the very air Marx breathed as a formidably cultured German intellectual in the great classical tradition of his society. Right? Marx, in fact, some of you may not know, Marx also had written poetry, right, and he had great admiration for for the greatest of the writers like Shakespeare, for instance. And if you read Das Kapital and some of his other works, you will be surprised to find excuse me, the literary allusions that we find in his text. We find here evidence of an absolutely fine mind who was not simply looking only only to make certain theoretical formulations on economics, on culture, on on culture in the sense of the material lives that we lead, but we find here a person who was also also so well versed in literature, and some of his writings really read like we saw in the example from Grundrisse, really read so beautifully when we look at them from an aesthetic point of view. Now, Eagleton therefore says that art and literature, it describes the milieu, okay, in which Marx was writing. Art and literature were part of the very air Marx breathed as a formidably cultured German intellectual in the great classical tradition of his society. His acquaintance with literature, from Sophocles to the Spanish novel, Lucretius to pot-boiling English fiction, was staggering in its scope. The German workers' circle he founded in Brussels devoted an evening a week to discussing the arts, and Marx himself was an inveterate theatre goer, declaimer of poetry, devourer of every species of literary art, from Augustan prose to industrial ballads. Okay, this is Eagleton giving us the background of how Marx was also steeped, among other things, in literature, right. Then we come to bringing in Trotsky here, because here we find how should I put it, a variant of Marxist literary criticism that was that many feel was deeply polemical, almost so to speak propagandist, right. So, what I want to do here is bring to you what Trotsky kind of argued for, okay, in his seminal book Literature and Revolution, published in 1924. Okay, so this kind of Trotsky's variant of Marxist literary criticism comes in for quite some flack from people who are who do not really follow the Marxist school of thought. Now, let us look at this slide here. Trotsky in Literature and Revolution says that when one practices literary criticism, one needs to one needs to lay focus on, not the formal aspects, not on the didactic aspects of the philosophy in there, not on the so called spiritual aspects, okay, of a text. He says that our job is to be polemical, right, to be problematic, okay, to be interventionist, so that when we perform literary criticism on a text, right, we are not simply looking at certainly not just a description of what the text is saying. We are not looking at its formal aspects. We need to be interventionist. The literary critic needs to intervene in the text in order to show the inequalities that are there in society, okay, in order to foreground the exploitation that is there in society. Hence, it is called polemical or interventionist. So, he says that let us look at the slide again. Literary criticism should be polemical, should be interventionist. The literary critic should eventually help in giving shape to cultural policy, okay, to social policy, and one should declare, this is very important with Trotsky, that one should declare what one's stance on art and culture is. One should also declare one's intellectual position, right. So, Trotsky here was very clear on the job, so to speak, or the function of a writer or of a critic. So, Trotsky says that culture feeds on the sap of economics, and the material surplus is necessary so that culture may grow, develop and become subtle. He says in The Social Roots and the Social Function of Literature that our Marxist conception of the objective social dependence and social utility of art, when translated into the language of politics, does not at all mean a desire to dominate art by means of decrees and orders. Okay. Here is Trotsky seeking to defend, okay, his view of what a Marxist criticism ought to be like. Okay. He says we just because we want to study the objective social dependence and the social utility of art doesn't mean that it is propagandist, right. So, we will stop here. Indeed, there is so much else to talk about. I could only bring just a few critics here. We should have also looked at Lukács and his theory of the novel, and we could have also looked at some of the way in which some of the texts may be looked at from an actual text would have been decoded from a Marxist perspective. What I wanted to do is first to bring to you some of the the very core, very elementary things that we should know about Marxism, because you cannot go straight to Marxist literary criticism without knowing what Marx had to say about society, about the organization structure of society, and why social change happens in the first place. And we therefore saw let me now pose some questions, right, so that we do this recap by posing some questions. For instance, if I ask you a question like this, how did Marx look at social structure and social change? How are we going to answer that question? One of the ways in which to answer this question obviously is to say that Marxism is an approach which is historical, which is materialist. Then we go on to say talk about the importance of history in Marxism, in Marx's general theory in particular, and we say that the source of meaning, the source of understanding a literary text, the source of our social lives, our cultural arrangements, the source of the nature of our social relations that we have, and eventually the source of the literary text is not something that is that is sort of outside of the material world that we live in. The source is not the idea. We have to go beyond the idea and say that our social consciousness, our literary consciousness comes from matter. That is the most important thing. Matter in the sense of the way our material lives are arranged, right? The ways in which the economic base works, right. The rules and regulations which determine the production, the distribution and consumption of material goods, that leads to a, as we understood, a superstructure, right. That base leads to a superstructure, and that superstructure is conditioned, though of course in very complex ways, okay, by the economic base. And what is entailed into superstructure? In the superstructure we found are entailed social institutions like the family, like religion, okay, like education and consciousness, art, literature. Okay. Second, if if we ask how is the literary text the social mentality of an age, and third, the social relations of an age, how are these related? Okay. Then we take recourse to Plekhanov's words, for instance, and we say that Marxist literary text looks at the social mentality, Marxist literary criticism looks at the social mentality of an age as being best demonstrated or indicated, so to speak, by art and literature. Art and literature are the best vehicles, so to speak, okay, of the social mentality of an age. Now, that social mentality is again related to the social relations of productions that are there at a certain given point of time. And finally, the social relations of production are determined by what? The way the economic arrangement is done in society. Do you follow? Okay. Then next we may ask a question like what is, we can ask what is the mode of writing that is most conducive, so to speak, to Marxist literary criticism, or that is expected from a writer. And we say that the realist mode is the mode of writing that is most conducive to an artist according to Marxist literary criticism. And the realist mode demands this from an artist, that he or she does not sort of go away from the type, okay, the type of characters that are, you could say, possible in a certain age or in a certain given socio-cultural milieu, right. We cannot move away from that if we have to be faithful to our depiction, or in our depiction of characters and setting. The setting should also reflect, so to speak, okay, in however problematic and complex a way, should be reflective of the actual material conditions that were extant in that time. Okay. So, this is demanded from and in this case it is really perhaps the realist novel that is the best exemplar of what Marxist literary criticism expects a writer to do, right. So, that was what, and we also remember Marx saying in the Grundriss that the epic is not sort of possible. Okay. Of course, one can self-consciously write, say that, well, I am in the 21st century and I am going to write an epic. We are not talking about that. The epic is in a different sense not possible in a time where, for instance, there is a printing press and where material conditions are very different from, say, ancient Greece, for instance. Okay. And then in there we saw, he said that the Iliad is not possible, the characters like Achilles are not possible in a time when the material conditions are very different. Okay. It is very important for us, there are many critiques of what is called the vulgar school of Marxist criticism, in the sense that one always expects, okay, one always expects a propagandist kind of writing, where always, for instance, the worker is, the worker is shown to be in a very simplistic way the finest of characters, whereas for instance, the capitalist is shown to be, where the characters are not fleshed out, there are no complexities. That is a vulgar kind of Marxist criticism that many have perhaps rightly so attacked. Okay. We also looked at Trotsky and Literature and Revolution, one of the classic pieces in Marxist literary criticism, and one that has been attacked also a lot by scholars who are against Marxist literary criticism by pointing to the fact that he always asks for interventionist, an interventionist mode by the literary critic and by the artist, for polemics, for eventually shaping cultural policy, right. But Trotsky himself says that, well, just because we want to find out the and sort of a scientific, systematic, objective, we want to carry out an objective inquiry through the literary text into the socio-cultural relations of production, into the economic base, does not mean that we are doing it in a doctrinaire sort of way, right. So, there is you perhaps sought a balance between the pleasure of reading a text for its own sake, and of course, bringing in social change by showing the way the text willingly or unwillingly, okay, reveals the social inequalities and the realities of exploitation of a certain age. Okay. So, these are some of the questions that are important that may come up. Well, there is indeed so much else to talk about as far as Marxist literary criticism is concerned, but stay with this. Okay. It is enough for us at this juncture to simply look at these important points, this say foundational points that we have raised in our lecture, and in the next lecture we shall move on with another school of criticism. Thank you for now. See you next time.